Hello everyone, welcome back to Introduction to Mind and Will. This week we're going to be talking about functionalism. To help introduce the topic, which we're also going to be discussing next week, we're going to look at Putnam's The Nature of Mental States. Okay, so before jumping into Putnam, brief introduction. So far, we've seen the dualist intuition, right? That the mind cannot be the same as the body, therefore it's not the same thing as the brain. But we've also seen a couple of challenges to it by now. Remember, the behaviorist, for instance, said that no, mental activity is really nothing over and above the behavior itself. So there is nothing more, for instance, to being in pain than the kind of behaviors we associate with pain. There's nothing behind that, right? We did see that some behaviorists adopt a more complex view, like Ryle's view, wherein they incorporate things like dispositions to behave. But by and large, behaviorists think that mental activity really just is behavior, if anything. Right? Identity theorists, on the other hand, we saw argued that no, there are such things as mental states, but these mental states just are brain states, right? So to have a certain kind of mental state then just means to have a certain kind of brain state. What is it to be in pain then for the identity theorist? It's to have a certain kind of thing going on in your brain. That's it. This week, we're going to look at a position that challenges all of these notions, specifically functionalism. So, functionalism is the view that mental states are identical with functional roles. Well, what are functional roles? Functional roles are states that mediate between a series of inputs and outputs, right? They allow for the transformation from one state of an organism or any kind of individual that's self-regulating in this way to another state, right? We're going to see more how that works as we get into Putnam's article. So let's jump in. His article is pain a brain state, right? That's the guiding question. It's all about, is pain a brain state? But note that just because he's investigating this claim doesn't mean that he's solely interested in pain. Pain is just being used as a stand-in for any mental state. He's talking about pain specifically because philosophers of mind, especially at this time, were talking about pain, right? Just as an example, right? We need an example of a mental state. Let's talk about pain, right? Okay, so he wants to consider the meaningfulness of the claim then that pain is a brain state, right? Ultimately, he's going to argue that, yes, it is a meaningful claim. It should be taken seriously. He's going to end up rejecting it. But before he does that, he wants to establish that, yeah, it should be taken seriously. So he considers three kinds of objections that could challenge the meaningfulness of the claim. We've seen some of these before. Let's go over them again. I'll go 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to break them down independently. First, pain cannot be a brain state because we know that we are in pain, but not realize that we're having a specific kind of brain state. Okay, so in other words, it might be the case that I'm aware that I'm experiencing pain, but not at all aware that I'm having a certain kind of brain state, right? I might not even know that brain states exist, right? So it seems like pain can't be a specific kind of brain state if that's true, right? I can know I'm having one and not the other. Second, two things cannot be identical if they do not share the same spatiotemporal region. So we get to say, for example, that heat is the same thing as mean kinetic molecular energy because it occupies the same spatiotemporal region as heat. If you didn't know, that is what temperature is, right? It's mean kinetic molecular energy. So if the kinetic energy between molecules is high, they're bouncing around a lot, the temperature is hot, right? If there's not a lot of movement going on, then it's cold, right? It's the same. That just is what cold and hot are, is mean kinetic molecular energy. So the idea here is that those things can be located at the same point in time and space, but that's not true for certain expressions of mental states. For example, it's not true for saying, I have pain in my arm and having a brain state. These two things seem to have different spatiotemporal regions, right? Okay. Finally, it might be that brain states can be correlated with being in pain, but there's no real way of showing that there's a stronger relationship between the two. So let's tackle these objections one by one. The first objection is something we've already seen when we looked at JCC Smart, right? This idea that there's this mismatch between brain states and mental states because we can know a lot about one and really little, if anything, about the other, right? I can know that I'm in pain without knowing that I'm having a corresponding brain state, right? Putnam thinks this is obviously not going to work, right? I can know that heat is mean molecular energy, and strike that. We know that heat is mean molecular energy, right? We know that as like a scientific society, right? We know that's the case. It's still possible, however, for someone to feel the heat of an oven and understand that the oven is hot, and yet fail to understand that there is a great degree of molecular kinetic energy here, right? It's possible for them to understand one and not the other, right? This is because there's two different concepts involved. There's the concept of temperature as this kind of phenomenal feel, and there's the concept of temperature as mean molecular kinetic energy, right? The concepts are doing different things. They're doing different things, but that doesn't mean that the phenomena is not identical, right? It doesn't mean the phenomena is not identical. Thus, it is possible to know that you're having a mental state without knowing anything at all about brain states. They're just perhaps two different kinds of concepts about the same identity, right? About the same kind of thing, right? Okay, we saw this with Smart already. Moving on then to objection 2. It's a bit more complicated. More or less it says that in order for two things to be identical, they have to share the exact same spatiotemporal region. Spatiotemporal region just means the same space and time, right? Spatio, space, temporal, time. So in order to be the same thing as something else, you have to be in the same place at the same time all the time, right? So temperature, then, we get to say, is identical to mean molecular kinetic energy because the two things are in the same place at the same time. But that's not true for pain in my arm and having a certain brain state, right? One seems to be located in my arm, the other seems to be located in my brain, right? Putnam's response here is fairly quick. He says, surely no one is going to be deterred from saying that mirror images are light reflected from an object and then from the surface of a mirror by the fact that an image can be located 3 feet behind the mirror, right? So the idea is this. We recognize that the image that appears in a mirror just is light that's being reflected from the objects in front of the mirror, right? Even though just by the appearance, when you're looking at the mirror, it seems like these objects are behind it, right? That you are in some way like looking through the mirror into what's behind it, right? So the idea then is just that it can appear that two things are not identical because it can appear that they're in different places or different times. But that doesn't mean that they really are, right? It could just be a misunderstanding of the phenomena. So by that reasoning, it's possible that the pain appears to be in my arm, but that it's not, right? It could be a misunderstanding of the phenomena, just like we could misunderstand a mirror to show us things behind it instead of in front of it, right? Okay, objection 3. This final objection is the view that there are two competing theories. One says that whenever I have a certain kind of mental state, there is a certain kind of brain state happening. There's a correlation between the two. But the other tries to draw a stronger claim, which is that they are the same thing, right? So the argument goes like this. You have no reason for concluding one over the other when both of them are capable of making the same predictions, right? Putnam's response again is fairly quick. He says, this argument too would show that light is only correlated with electromagnetic radiation. The mistake is in ignoring the fact that although the theories in question may indeed lead to the same predictions, they open and exclude different questions. Okay, so again, in case you didn't know, Light just is electromagnetic radiation, right? There is an identity relation between the two things. Okay. But it is true that the theory of that light is electromagnetic radiation is challenged by this other theory that the two are only correlated, right? Both theories could go around making the same predictions. That doesn't mean, Putnam is arguing, that we should not acknowledge the identity between the two. Why? Because if you don't, you start to get several kinds of questions that aren't going to lead you anywhere. For example, what is light really then? Right? If you adopt the view that, well, light's merely correlated with electromagnetic radiation, suddenly now you're on the hook for answering this question. What is light really? Right? Or what makes light accompany electromagnetic radiation, explaining the fact that they're correlated without being identical. Right? So it's not the case, Putnam is arguing, that these two theories are necessarily on equal footing, or that one is more simplistic than the other, right? There's going to be more questions that come out of one. Okay. The verdict. Putnam concludes that you do have to take the claim seriously that pain could just be a brain state. But he doesn't want to come down one way or the other in terms of whether or not it's a meaningful move to collapse the two phenomena into one, right? For some complicated reasons that we don't have to get into. Right? What he's going to suggest instead is that we attempt to find a view that does not try to show that pain is identical with anything in relation to a form of synonymy, right? Synonymy you can think of as like a replacement view, right? So there was this, now there's this. That's the way of understanding it, right? These two things are interchangeable. His view is going to suggest that pain is the kind of thing where the two sides are not interchangeable, right? We'll see how this works. Okay. So ultimately, he's going to argue, no, pain is not just a brain state. There's a better view, specifically functionalism, right? Okay. So Putnam thinks of organisms as Turing machines, or maybe, because he has to update it according to reasoning at the time, probabilistic automata. What you need to know about these things is just that these are self-regulating systems that involve rules, right? Turing machines are deterministic, right? They have set rules that don't change, right? So they're always going to treat inputs the same way, always, right? The system's deterministic. But the thing to take away from both of these is that there are rules within the thing that govern how inputs are transitioned into outputs, how states within the machine are transitioned into other states, right? So there's some kind of rule governing how a state becomes another, right? Or how an input is turned into an output, right? Those rules, the way these things are done, are going to be called functional roles, right? Okay, so for functionalism then, mental states just are the states of a system acting in accord with certain rules to move from one state to another, right? Mental states just are those states, the things that allow transitioning from one state to another or from input to output, okay? So why not identity theory? What does Putnam see that is wrong with the view? Well, he thinks that it's not quite vague enough, right? He sees the vagueness of his position, functionalism, as being a virtue. We'll soon see why. He thinks, here's what it would take for the identity theory to actually work. The identity theorist is going to need to identify a specific kind of physical chemical state that means pain, right? It's all well and good when you're just going to say, being in pain is having a certain kind of brain state. Okay, well, you need to say what brain state that is, what brain state pain is. The catch is this. Once you've identified that physical chemical state that's identical with pain, it needs to be the case that every instance of pain is like that. Every instance of pain just is that exact same physical chemical state. What's the problem? Well, there's all kinds of different brains, right? There's mammalian brains, there's reptilian brains, there's mollusk brains. Here, Putnam is specifically talking about octopi, right? He wants to say, look, there are all kinds of brains that belong to creatures that we now think have the capacity to feel pain. Your view is going to have to say there's a physical chemical state that each and every one of these brains has. They all have it, right? Wherever there's pain in the universe, there has to be this exact same kind of brain state. For obvious reasons, he thinks that's not going to work, right? An octopus's brain is not the same as a human brain. The chances of you being able to identify some specific physical chemical state that's shared between the two is already quite low. The chance of that specific thing being what lies behind pain specifically, even lower, right? This problem becomes worse then when we consider that we're just talking about pain as an example. But identity theorists think that all mental states, not just pain, has to be identical with some brain state or other, right? So this problem is going to expand to every specific kind of mental state that you could have, right? For every kind of mental state, there has to be a specific kind of physical chemical state of a brain, okay? And that kind of thing needs to be shared across all organisms that have the capacity of possessing those mental states, right? It's going to be quite a challenge to locate these things if it's going to be possible at all, right? But a functional role, Putnam argues, can be achieved by any number of means. Any number of means, right? Not just brains. Okay, we'll get to this more soon. Putnam then jumps to talking about behavior. He acknowledges that we identify mental states based on behavior, right? Hunger, thirst, pain, etc. Putnam argues we all identify these because of the behaviors of the organism that has them, right? There are similar patterns of behavior, he wants to argue, between these related mental states, shows that what we're doing is pinpointing functional roles, right? So there's a functional role that pain provides us, specifically to move us out of harm's way, to avoid noxious stimuli, things like that. Hunger causes us to seek nourishment necessary for our survival, etc., right? So these things we identify through behavior, but we understand the behavior to be towards some end, right? There's a functional role being performed by the organism, right? So rather than the behaviorist who identifies these behaviors as the mental state, Putnam, along with Armstrong, remember, wants to say, no, these point towards something behind them. What is behind them? A functional role, right? What these behaviors are for, okay? But these functional roles don't need to be realized by any specific kind of brain state, right? Because a functional role can be achieved in any number of ways. We might even have different rules that allow for the same kind of transformation between inputs and outputs, right? So long as the functional role is achieved, that's really all that matters. It doesn't matter, for instance, what the machine is built out of. It doesn't matter what the machine is built out of. So we can explain now why octopi seem to have the ability to feel pain even though their brains are remarkably different from our own, right? It's because we're not looking for a specific kind of physical chemical process or state, right? No, we're looking for a functional role. And different kinds of brains can express the same functional role, okay? For this reason, we say that pain is multiply realizable. We're going to hear this term a lot next week. Multiple realization, right? Multiple realization. So multiple realization just speaks to the ability of some kind of phenomena to be present in different ways, right? So in octopi, for example, the functional role of pain can be realized in, let's say, brain process B, right? While in humans, the functional role can be realized in brain process A. The fact that you can have the same thing showing up in different ways means that it's multiply realizable, right? Multiply realizable. Okay. Consequences of this view is that because we have identified a functional role as something that's multiply realizable and therefore mental states that are something multiply realizable, we are now moving away from this notion that substance is what makes a mind what it is. Instead, we're looking at function is what makes a mind what it is. One of the consequences that falls out of that is that not only are different kinds of brains going to be able to realize these functional roles, but maybe non-brains too. Earlier in the article, for instance, Putnam makes a big deal about the fact that functionalism might be perfectly consistent with the dualism, right? So long as the sort of ghost mind or the ghost in the machine style view of dualism holds that the mind, as separate from anything physical, can behave according to these functional roles, okay, it counts, right? It's expressing functional roles, right? So you could even be, strictly speaking, I'm not familiar with anyone who does this, but strictly speaking, if Putnam's right, you could be a dualistic functionalist, okay? But it also means you could have a physical view in which there are minds without brains, right? So, for example, there might be a mind that's composed entirely by computer chips. So long as those computer chips allow for the same kind of functional roles as brains do, then it doesn't matter how that function is achieved, right? So long as the function is achieved, it's good enough. It gets to count. Being in pain, remember, is having a certain kind of functional role. That functional role can be realized in any number of ways, not just in organic matter. Okay. So the possibility of AI, that kind of thing, if you're a functionalist, real possibility, right? Putnam thinks that's a strength of functionalism. Remember, he thought that vagueness of the view was a virtue, right? It was a virtue. The vagueness allows him to show why all kinds of different sorts of brains and maybe other things can express the exact same kinds of behaviors in exactly the same kinds of way, right? It's functional role that's responsible, not brain state. But as we're going to see next week, this opens the view up to its greatest challenges. So next week, we'll see how some people push back on functionalism because of this rampant multiple realizability. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe.